Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we explore history, religion, and culture. For those not fully up to speed on their classical references, Mount Olympus was the place where, as you suddenly now remember, the Greek gods lived. So an Olympian judgment is an assessment utterly dispassionate, impartial, delivered from far above the mad squabbling of mere mortals. And that's what we aspire to. But the fog. The fog. Anyway, today's topic is Zionism, the British Mandate, and the foundation of the State of Israel, which is number 4 in our series on Israel and Jewish history.
Maybe you can answer for us, what is Zionism? Because lots of people who sound anti Semitic are saying they're not, they're just anti Zionist. And lots of people who are staunch Israel supporters are calling anyone who criticizes Israel's actions as anti Semitic, which sounds a little bit unfair. So, what is Zionism?
Well, both the categories of people to whom you refer are being a little bit dishonest in their debating strategies. I'm afraid this isn't the only subject around which that happens, as we see every day on the news, right? Dishonest debating strategies, but that's certainly there with this. And of course, it's got real sting on both sides in this case. What do we mean by Zionism? Well, Zionism is essentially Jewish nationalism, and it refers particularly to the idea that the Jewish people should have a state, Israel. It's a spectrum of opinion, like everything else, free market opinions, socialism, you name it. It's actually a spectrum of opinions. So it could be just that minimum, or it could get really hard line and want to say either make life very difficult for or even expel non-Jews. It might have maximalist territorial aspirations, right? So it's a spectrum of opinion from relatively moderate to through to very hard line. But essentially, it is Jewish nationalism as we understand it today. So let's just take a look at a couple of little pictures here of pre-First World War Palestine. We need to remember it was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And from the 1880s, the number of Jews there, which was pretty small, started to be augmented by Jews coming there from Europe. And in particular from the area of Europe where 3/4 of all Jews lived, namely Eastern or East Central Europe. So the western borderlands of the Russian Empire and perhaps a little further west than that. So here we've got a nice picture of some Jews praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 1870. The Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, of course, being the last remnant of what was the Second Temple, destroyed after the fighting in AD 70 in the Jewish revolt against the Romans. And another picture here from Bethlehem, a picture taken from the Church of the Nativity. When I was there nearly 30 years ago now, it seems to me that it still looks pretty much like that. And we should mention early on this very strange man who plays an important part in the story we're going to be looking at today, Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was born in Belarus, White Russia, part of the Russian Empire, emigrated to Jerusalem in 1881 when he would have been 23 years old, and he worked to revive Hebrew, but in a modern form, as the spoken language of all Jews.
So, what was the status of Hebrew before this time? What was it used for?
Really just for religious purposes, synagogue services and so on. It wasn't really used outside of that. And what he was doing was insisting that it should be the daily speech of Jews. And his poor wife and children, he wouldn't speak to them in any other language but Hebrew, which must have been particularly hard because, of course, nobody outside of the household was speaking that at the time. But he is the trailblazer for bringing this language back from almost effectively from the dead. It would have been a bit like trying to bring back Latin, I suppose, in other contexts. And of course, it's the daily speech of the state of Israel today. The state of Israel, of course, was a very dim and distant prospect at the time that he was doing this. But he plays that very important part. So, although there is Zionism before the next person we need to look at, Theodor Herzl, that is, there were some Jews who were coming to the idea that the Jews should move to Israel and it should somehow be a homeland. Theodor Herzl has an incredibly important place in Jewish and indeed Israeli history because he's the founder of secular Zionism as a political movement, as an organization, or as it became a set of organizations.
And when we say secular Zionism, why specify that it's secular?
Well, because it's not a religious movement as such. And Herzl himself wasn't particularly religious. It's modelled on Western nationalism, modern Western nationalism, which had really only properly come into existence, most historians say, with the French Revolution, and had been a growing force during the course of the 19th century. And this is something that I think many of us have experienced in daily life. Nothing will provoke nationalism more than somebody else's nationalism, right? So
Right.
if you're speaking to someone from another country and they're getting extremely nationalistic, even if you're not particularly nationalistic, you're likely to start to tilt that way in reaction. Well, Herzl and a number of Jews had come to the conclusion that modern nationalism was not going to define the states of Europe in ways that included them. It might do back in the days of Daniele Manin as the leader of the Venetian Revolution. Remember, he was a Jewish lawyer. It has seemed that it could and that it would, but that wasn't the way it was working out for reasons that we looked at last time. And so he's founding Zionism as a nationalist movement. And his most important work is The Jewish State, an attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question. It comes out in 1896, and it is, in that sense, the foundation document of the modern Zionist political movement. Now, we've got some excerpts from part of that document here, and I think it's a good idea if we just go through what he has to say so we can get the flavour of this. The idea, he says, that I've developed in this pamphlet is an ancient one. It's the restoration of the Jewish state. Well, if it had been more or less at one with the messianic hope for Jews down the centuries, it wasn't a live political program as he was launching it. The decisive factor, he says, is our propelling force. And what is that force? The plight of the Jews. If many Jews simultaneously agree on it, it's entirely reasonable, and its achievement presents no difficulties worth mentioning. Now, I think if I'd been someone reading this in 1896, whether I'd been Jewish or not, I think I would have been tempted to laugh because it seems so absurd. No difficulties worth mentioning. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. The proportion of Jews living there was really small. And somehow this was just going to be wrested free for the asking. And yet, of course, 52 years later, that's exactly what happened. Now, perhaps it wasn't quite as crazy as that sentence makes it sound, because he actually thought that the powerful nations of the West would lean on the Ottoman Empire. They were bullying that empire a lot in the last century of its existence. And lean on it, he hoped, to that end. So it was worth trying to influence some of the Western states along these lines. The idea, he says, depends only on the number of its adherents. Perhaps our ambitious young men, to whom every road of advancement is now closed, and for whom the Jewish state throws open a bright prospect of freedom, happiness, and honour, perhaps they'll see to it that this idea is spread. Now, again, that expression, to whom every road of advancement is now closed, that will have seemed to be perfectly fair enough and logical from a Jewish perspective, because there was still obviously a lot of anti Jewish prejudice, but the new professions were particularly dominated by Jews, disproportionately so, as we saw last time. Um, to the extent that in a number of countries, universities introduced the notorious numerus clausus, which was basically putting a lid on the proportion of students admitted who were Jewish, which seems very unfair. That's against them. But lots of non-Jews thought the Jews were taking up all the space in the new professions that they were advancing at the expense of everybody else. Now, of course, particularly in America, this is not a problem that's quite gone away, even if the different groups involved and the configurations might be different now. Right? I consider, he says, the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, even though it sometimes takes these and other forms. It's a national question. So he's openly and clearly borrowing from modern Western post 18th century nationalist thought. And to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world in council. So he's looking to the Britons, the Frances, the Americas, and so on to lean on the Ottoman Empire. Then there's this striking short little sentence: we are a people, one people. Now, this is powerful political rhetoric. Let's just remind ourselves this is written in German and do a little mental back translating here. Wir sind ein Volk. Ein Volk. Who in your mind's eye can you see shouting such a line from a podium? Am I implying that this is like a sort of Jewish Nazism? Nothing of the sort. As we will doubtless see in future episodes when I teach on the background to the Second World War, the Nazis invented nothing. They simply culled a whole load of ideas that were out there in the ether in various countries at various social niveau and combined them in an incredibly toxic way, and of course made an absolute fetish of anti-Semitism. What I'm saying by making this point, which to some people will seem extremely edgy, I realise, is that this kind of rhetoric, this way of talking, was out there. Right? Herzl didn't invent it. The Nazis didn't invent it. This was populist nationalist rhetoric. The idea of the unity of some people group. And of course, people groups are generally not united, but fictively, for the purposes of nationalist aspirations, they are. We've sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It's not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we've lived for centuries, we're still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors hadn't yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. Now, this reflects his own disillusionment. Herzl, remember, is born in Budapest. There's a square named after him in central Budapest today. He moved as a young man to Vienna and became a journalist there, and was sent by one of the Vienna newspapers as a foreign correspondent to France. Now, the received view about how Herzl changed his mind and came to hold the beliefs that he did is that while he was in France, he was there during the height of the paroxysms around the Dreyfus affair that we talked about last time, and that it was seeing this and the scandal that it was that persuaded him Jews are never going to be accepted. The only solution that we have is to create a nationalism of our own. But what can we do? We're not a majority anywhere except within a few streets or a shtetl in Poland or something. We're going to have to find another land, and the obvious place is Palestine. Now, this fairly recent biography by Shlomo Avineri, Herzl's Vision, pushes back against this canonical view and says, yeah, certainly he came to these conclusions, but he did so as a result of his experience simply of living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He didn't need to go to France to get to this. It was his experiences back home. Well, we can't get into that debate, and certainly I'm not in a position to do so. Okay, so back to Herzl again. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Jew baiting has merely winnowed out our weaklings. The strong among us defiantly return to their own whenever persecution breaks out. Wherever we remain politically secure for any length of time, we assimilate. Now, he used to think that was a good thing. He says, I think this is not praiseworthy. Palestine is our unforgettable historic homeland. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and in our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind. Well, those incredibly resounding words, of course. Sadly, he died just 8 years later in 1904 of overwork. But his movement lived on, and you can almost say he's like a sort of patron saint of Israel, because what he envisioned did actually come to pass in 1948. Well, at the time, it still must have seemed pretty crazy, but the movement was starting to build in Europe.
In our previous episode on anti Semitism, Jewish people were already generally in support of nationalism, but now Herzl is calling for something that's specifically Jewish nationalism.
Yeah, Jews are frequently in favour of nationalism of the places, the countries in which they live, the territories in which they live. They're certainly inclined that way. At least the more secular ones amongst them are. The religious ones don't want anything to do with this, and they don't want anything to do with Zionism either, as we'll see in a moment. So yeah, there is a kind of a switch there. But as Jews become increasingly disillusioned with the idea that you can be as patriotic a German as you want, but if people are still going to be prejudiced against you, as patriotic a Frenchman as you like, it's not, look at Dreyfus, what's going on, what's that all about, right? Then there is this propensity for particularly the kinds of Jews that want to get on in the secular professions, the most modern kind, the less pious, to come around to Herzl's way of thinking. Yes, yes. So a big step in this direction happens in 1917, and we've got this nice picture here of General Allenby, British general, entering Jerusalem. And I've said the modern Middle East crisis starts here for reasons we'll look at in a moment.
So the British are moving troops into what had been Ottoman territory for 400 years. This is part of the fighting in World War One, right?
Right, yes. And the British had not been doing terribly well fighting the Ottomans for the first half of the war. They'd been struggling against them in Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. They had been trying to push up from Egypt and not having notable success. And of course, everybody knows about the disaster in Gallipoli in 1915. But 1917 was the breakthrough year when they rolled the Ottomans back pretty much on all fronts and entered Jerusalem. Well, this was considered a historic moment. The Ottomans had, with a few small intermissions, run Palestine for 400, if you want to be exact, 401 years, right? And now another power has taken over, and it doesn't really look as if the Ottomans are going to get it back again. And very shortly after this, a government minister, the foreign secretary, Arthur Balfour, sends a letter to Baron Rothschild. Now, Baron Rothschild was an incredibly wealthy British Jewish financier, super loyal to Britain, and it's to be transmitted to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. Great Britain and Ireland. Remember that at this point, Ireland, the whole island, was still just about part of the British state. That would change shortly afterwards. We can't go there now. And in this famous declaration, he says, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. And of course, now they're in control there, so they can. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
Okay, but this confuses me. I mean, how can Palestine be made a national home for the Jewish people without prejudicing against the rights of the existing non Jewish population?
Well, you're quite right to be confused because this is a fatal move by the British. They're promising the same goods to two different groups of people, and that can't very easily be squared. Right? You can't really turn Palestine or even a large chunk of Palestine into a national home for the Jews without prejudicing the interests of the people who are living there right now who aren't Jewish. And this was the bind that the British got themselves into, and it would plague them from that moment right down to 1948 when they finally got out. But nevertheless, this was by many people, particularly in Britain and America, uh, considered to be a historic moment, a triumph. And we can see here this US lithograph depicting the 1917 capture of Jerusalem as being a latter day equivalent of the triumph of Judas Maccabeus, who rose up against Greek rulers in the 2nd century BC. So you've got Judas Maccabeus on the left there, and General Allenby on the right. We've got a Star of David flag on the left, a Union Jack on the right, and in the middle at the top there, can you see it? It's President Wilson. He was a strong Zionist with the stars and stripes on either sides of him and an American eagle above that. So this is pretty triumphalist stuff.
And I'm guessing the excited people in America who are creating stuff like this will be some American Jews and maybe the Christian Zionists, especially the dispensationalists we looked at in the first episode.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's who they will be. Maybe even most American Jews, but a lot of the Christian Zionists too, yeah, and the dispensationalists were the core of that, as they would remain throughout the 20th century. Yes, they're seeing this as a great hope. There were some dispensational preachers like Gaebelein who thought that Zionism was they saw that it was a secular movement, and they wanted to see the Jews take their homeland back as part of a great end times revival where Jews would become Christians and this kind of thing. But nevertheless, most of those kind of Christian Zionists got past that point to say, this has got to be a good thing, this is what we want. Well, in the interwar period, the British ran Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. The League of Nations was it's like a predecessor organization to the United Nations, operated between the two world wars. It was very unsuccessful, as we know, because the Second World War happened. So at the end of the Second World War, an attempt was made to start afresh with the United Nations, which has only very occasionally had successes, I suppose. So during that British Mandate period, between the wars, a lot of Jews were moving there. So we've got a picture here of some leaving Poland in the late 1920s. But nevertheless, we don't want to overstate this. A lot of religious Jews thought that Zionism was a false hope. Now, I want to refer here to a wonderful writer about whom we will talk a lot in future episodes, some months, maybe a year or so from now. He's one of my favourite writers, Freud. And we've got a picture of him here. And this is just a couple of comments from his book, The Wandering Jews, written in 1927. He observed that a lot of religious Jews actually despised Zionism. Now, what he's quoting here, he's putting words into the mouths of the ultra Orthodox, or maybe just the Orthodox Jews, and the way that they think. What does the nobleman know of the inner meaning of life? He may know the laws of the land, build railways, invent all manner of curious things, write books, go hunting with kings. But what are all these compared to a tiny character in the Holy Scripture, or the most ignorant question from the youngest Talmud student? The Jew who thinks like this, says Roth, will not be greatly interested in any law that promises him personal and national liberty. This Jew is not a nationalist in the Western sense. He does not fight for any Palestine. He detests the Zionist, who uses ridiculous European methods to try to set up a Judaism that doesn't deserve the name, because it won't abide the coming of the Messiah and God's change of heart towards the Jews, which is sure to come. An Orthodox Hasid from the East would prefer a Christian to a Zionist, for the latter would change Judaism root and branch. His Jewish nation would be along the lines of a European state. And of course, that is exactly what happened. You know, nationalism is a Western Enlightenment rationalist concept. Right? Nationalists love to maintain, and this is a huge topic we'll deal with another time, that their nations go back to the Middle Ages and that people back in the past thought of themselves in terms of a national identity the way they do today. It's simply not true. Simply not true. Right? It's a modern construct, and Zionism, in the eyes of lots of pious Jews, was simply copying from Gentile Enlightenment rationalism. Okay, well, one other important character we should mention during this period is Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He's a founder in 1923 of revisionist Zionism. It's revisionist not in the sense that it's paring back anything that Herzl had said, but if anything, making it a lot more forceful, prepared to use muscle, military means. And he sets up the militaristic youth movement, Betar, in 1923. Here's a picture of a chapter of Betar in Berlin in 1936. Notably, of course, we're now 3 years into the Hitler dictatorship in Germany.
And they look pretty fierce, I would say.
Yeah, they do. I wouldn't want to run into them in the street. But in the early 20th century, militaristic kind of youth movements were all the rage. I mean, even something that we think of now as totally innocuous, like the Boy Scouts, set up by Baden-Powell, right, on the eve of World War One. Nevertheless, it was in a uniform. The whole thing had a kind of army ethos because this was considered good for our young people to make them healthy and fit and disciplined and so on. And what happens is that takes different forms. It's used in different parts of the world because it's clearly a very successful movement. It still exists today. Um, Between the wars, lots of hardline political movements of one kind or another copied this idea and borrowed it. And of course, that's what Jabotinsky's doing. So it's Zionism clearly pushing itself. And we should also mention Hashomer Hatzaya, the Youth Guard, which was a socialist Zionist youth organization. We should mention that an awful lot of Zionism is actually socialist. It was founded in Galicia. That's what today we call Western Ukraine. Between the world wars, it was southeastern Poland, now Western Ukraine, in 1913. Just the same area as Josef Roth came from, actually. By the eve of World War II, it had 70,000 members, mostly in Eastern Europe, and it sought to integrate Marxism and psychoanalysis, both creeds developed by Jewish thinkers, Karl Marx, Jewish background, and psychoanalysis, think Sigmund Freud, into their way of thinking. They founded kibbutzim. A kibbutz is like an agricultural collective, not on the Soviet model, thank goodness, but voluntary, usually run by young people in British Mandate Palestine between the world wars. And it launched a political party, the Socialist League of Palestine, in 1936. During World War II, back in Europe, it organized resistance and rescue of Jews. And after the end of the war, it organised illegal immigration into Palestine. Some of them joined the Haganah militia fighting against the British, who were trying to restrict the number of Jews who were coming. So we need to look now at this interwar British mandate. Here is a map showing its outline. So it's very similar to the frontiers of Israel today. At the end of World War One, most of the Arab lands of what had been the Ottoman Empire were divided up between the British and the French, who basically supervised local administrations, with the French having control of Syria and Lebanon, the British having Mesopotamia, which is now becoming Iraq, and Transjordan, which we would now call Jordan, as well as Palestine. Now these kind of divisions were made simply by British and French diplomats. All those states in the Middle East today are not necessarily natural. They're not chosen by the people that lived there. They are the result of late colonial administrators drawing lines on maps, with consequences that we still live with. Now, we should perhaps consider Palestine's population. In 1922, as we can see, there were just over 750,000 people living there, and only 11% of those are Jewish. The others are Palestinians, 78% Muslim, 10% Christian, 1% other. I'm pretty sure that most of those will have been Druze. And over the course of the next 23 years, down to the end of World War II, that population does a lot more than double. Well, Muslim numbers double, but you can see that at the end of the period, they're only 60% of the population. Christian numbers don't quite double, but not too far short of it, but they decline from 10% to 8%. The others at the bottom, about the same. It's the Jews who vastly increase in number. And it's not simply down to differential birth rates, it is down to a massive influx of people coming from Europe. So they move from being 11% of the population to 31%. The problem that the British had was that on the one hand, they were giving the come on to Jews to come and live there. They'd said it could be a national homeland for the Jews. On the other hand, they were trying to restrict the flood, which was annoying Jews who were there. They wanted to say to the British, stop, just let people come. But of course, the non-Jews were becoming more and more fearful that they were simply going to lose their land. They were going to be taken over. It was bad enough but being ruled by these people from the other side of Europe, the far end of Europe. But now all these people were going to come in and simply be the bulk of the population, not simply colonial administrators. So the British were getting it from both sides, but you'd have to say that after the ambiguity of the Balfour Declaration, they kind of deserved it. Not that that should stop us feeling sorry for the poor British Tommy on the streets who's got to try and put up with all this, and keep control. I speak with a little bit of feeling because my father was there, not at this time, but after World War II. That's where he did his military service. And I had an uncle who was in the military police there at the same time. And it was absolutely unnerving. You had no idea who was going to take a pop at you.
What was the reason that the British were trying to sort of stave off the influx of the Jews?
Well, they were and they weren't. They were allowing Jews to come, but at a limited rate. But at a rate that was much too much for the locals to accept, but not nearly enough to satisfy what Jews wanted, particularly the Jews who were already there. They wanted more Jews to come so that they would eventually be a majority and they would take over the land.
Right.
So, yeah, they could satisfy nobody, but they had made contradictory promises. That was the problem. So, during this period, the interwar period, over 1/3 Jews immigrated legally to Palestine, as well as 33,000 non-Jews. about 50 to 60,000 Jews immigrated illegally. I don't know where we get that number from, because if somebody comes illegally, how do you know they're even there? But we will take it that the number was something like that.
Do you think that a wall would have helped them?
What a delicious idea! They'd have had to have built one all along the coast, apart from anything else, wouldn't they? Yeah. Uh,
I suppose.
a forlorn enterprise, anyway. So by the end of the war, Jews are making up almost a third of the population. Now, we've got a picture here of Jewish demonstrators who are running away from a police baton charge. Those will, of course, be British police in Jerusalem in May 1930.
So, why were the Jews demonstrating in the first place?
They were demonstrating against the restrictions on Jewish immigration. They're unhappy about that. Um, and I guess this demonstration's got a little out of hand. Police don't do baton charges any and every demonstration. It can't have been just a peaceful march, and so it's kind of deteriorated to this point. Our next picture comes from the same year, and it's Palestinian women carrying a banner. And my Arabic is, as you know, absolutely red hot. Now, I have no idea. I've just taken this from the source where I found the picture. Their banner reads, "No dialogue, no negotiations until termination." And by termination, they mean termination of the mandate. So, British out, and then we, as Palestinians, who are still a majority here, will negotiate with Jews about what they can and can't do. So, these, of course, completely mutually exclusive demands. Well, the situation got to the point where, in the few years just before World War II, there was actually a Palestinian revolt against the British. It wasn't wholesale, it wasn't all Arabs, but some of the more hardline Palestinian groups rose against the British from 1936 to 39. You can see from the number of casualties there that, although it's a large number and it's lamentable, those clearly aren't the numbers that would die in a wholesale war or civic convulsion. And clearly, the Palestinians are not as well armed as the British. So 5,000 Arabs die in the revolt, 400 Jews are killed, and 200 British.
So, the Jews are protesting and the Palestinians are outright revolting, even though they want completely opposite things. Would they have worked together against the Brits?
No, absolutely not. Being opposed to British policy and British rule was about the only thing they had in common. The Jews didn't necessarily want the British out. They wanted the British to stay there to supervise a transition in Palestine to a Jewish state, right? Which is, I suppose, a fair interpretation of the opening sentences of the Balfour Declaration, right? Whereas the Palestinians simply want the British out because they fear precisely that outcome. So at this stage, at least, the Jewish complaint is non-violent. It will become violent after World War II. It's non-violent. It's directed more against British policy than against the fact of British rule, which they kind of like, or is at least useful to them at that moment. Well, here we've got some suspected Arab rebels captured by the British near Jerusalem in 1939. And in the same month, here are some Jewish protesters. Now, you can find similar protests happening actually in London and New York. Save our children and our parents, placards demanding admission for Jewish refugees from Nazism. And Jews in London and, well, in Britain generally, were demanding that the British admit Jews into Britain. Jews in America demanding that their government admit more Jewish refugees into the United States to flee Nazi persecution. The Holocaust had not yet been unleashed at this point, but the treatment of Jews, not just in Germany, but in a number of other countries, had become really pretty horrible. And so a lot of Jews were more and more desperate to get out. Well, a few months later, we've got this Jewish protest here by a load of people, looks like mostly ladies, but not entirely. And this is a protest against the white paper. Now, just to explain for non-British people in the audience, which I'm sure is the large majority of them, a white paper is a document produced by the government of the day in London, setting out the general aims of intended legislation. That's kind of throwing it out and saying, okay, this is where we plan to go. Yes, we're going to tweak it, but we're going to be introducing a bill broadly along these lines very soon. So this white paper proposed a Jewish state within 10 years, but calling for limiting Jewish immigration and land acquisitions. So again, that's the British policy is facing both ways. A Jewish state within 10 years will have terrified Palestinians, but it also deeply worried Jews, particularly if you've fairly recently immigrated to Israel and you're worried about your parents or your auntie or your uncle or your cousins back in Poland or Austria or somewhere. You're going to be thinking, my gosh, no, the British have to allow any Jews who want to come here in right now. Well, you can imagine that for some phases of World War II, if you were Jewish and living in Palestine, you'll have been very worried indeed, particularly when Rommel was pushing to try and take Cairo in Egypt. And you'd be thinking to yourself, my gosh, if he breaks through the British there and comes sweeping up into Palestine, we're done for. And that will have inclined you to be as helpful as possible to the British during that period. But by late stages of the war, when it's pretty clear who's going to win and it's not going to be the Nazis, you will have reverted to your previous attitude. Come on, British, you have to allow Jews in. And once the war is over and the massive, massive extent of what we now call the Holocaust was becoming clear, 6 million people killed by the Nazis, loads of surviving Jews in Europe wanted to get out. Now, many of them went to America, but many more wanted to get out to Palestine, to Israel. And you can see from this map the numbers of people going from the different countries in Europe during the late 1940s. Those are the first couple of years of the existence of the State of Israel. Before 1948, however, there was even more severe pressure on the British. Now, because the violence was getting so intense, what the British in the end was simply to get out and leave the Jews and the Arabs to fight one another. Just before we get quite to that stage, though, let's look at some maps here, because it's really at this moment, it's the first of these maps, the one on the left-hand side, that shows the extent of Jewish-owned land in Palestine before 1948. And those are the areas in white. So even though by this time Jews were nearly a third of the population, they didn't own nearly a third of the land. They had made significant acquisitions, but most of it still belonged to its traditional owners. And as we shall see in a minute, what the United Nations proposed in late 1947 was partition, with the Jews getting the areas in that second map that is in white, and the rest being left to the Palestinians. The third map shows the results of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 and what Israel actually became at the moment of its founding in 1948, the area in white. So same general outlines, but bigger than the United Nations had proposed. We'll leave the map on the right for discussion a bit later. The next couple of pictures show us the most notorious of Jewish guerrilla attacks on the British, and that's the bombing of the King David Hotel on the 22nd of July 1946, which killed 91 people, a large number of them actually Jewish secretaries and administrative staff who were working for the British, and 46 being killed. And I'm afraid that the double tap terrorist bomb strike had already been invented. So shortly afterwards, there's a second bomb exploding at the King David Hotel, obviously designed to catch people who are rescuing people from the first. So it was a shocking event. It's something I remember learning about very early from my father. I don't know the exact dates he was on military service in the Holy Land, but I suspect from the fact that he so quickly told me about this that it was while he was there. Well, our next picture shows Haganah fighters. These pictures look staged from 1947, so perhaps doing training, whether to attack the British or whether to attack Arab towns and villages.
Not many armies have used women soldiers. That would have been pretty unusual for the time, I would think.
Yes, yes. The Soviet Union used some, and pilots, particularly they used snipers, most famously in World War II. But yeah, but basically this was still an innovation. But this is a kind of a development in the entire change in mentality that Zionists wanted to bring about, the move to Israel. That for hundreds of years they'd been adopting, let us say, a kind of cringe mentality, trying to soften and appease people around them so that they could simply live or make a living in the lands where they were. And this was one of the things that was being sloughed off by the new Zionists. No, we're going to be tough. We've had it with hundreds of years of being pushed around. We're going to have our own land. Get out of the way. And having women ready to fight as well was part of that. So yes, it's and still, of course, there are women serving in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, even today.
Mhm.
When the United Nations makes apparent its partition plan in late 1947, that creates uproar amongst Palestinians who now find that they're going to lose a large part, perhaps even the major part of their property, of their lands. And so this picture shows Arabs burning Jewish possessions in Jerusalem. A lot of Jews at that time lived in the old city. That wouldn't last, the fighting. So those people are quite vulnerable. And our next picture shows, and this kind of sums up the British predicament in these last days. It's a very tense moment. There's a white ambulance escorted by British troops carrying wounded Jews through an Arab crowd at the Jaffa Gate. And you really would not have wanted to be there in that situation. It just shows that an impossible impasse had been reached. Our next picture is of a Jewish cab that's been set ablaze by an angry mob near the Damascus Gate. At the very end of 1947, there, Jews had been shooting from a taxi and had killed 15 people, including 12 Arabs, 2 British constables, and a Jew. And so this is a mob setting on another cab. And our next pictures show the Ben Yehuda Street bombings. So 2 trucks exploding on Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem in February 1948, killing 27 people and injuring more than 100. And then a few days later, or later in the same month, another bomb going off in the same street with 51 people killed this time.
The purpose of these bombings and whatnot by the Arabs was to prevent the implementation of the UN's partition plan.
Yes, yes. To intimidate Jews. Maybe if we kill enough of them, then they will stop coming, and some who've arrived will leave, and we'll be kind of preparing the ground for a conflict that is clearly coming. Yes, and even if we can't actually drive all these Jews out, then maybe we can at least make sure that we have this piece of territory or that piece of territory, or that Jerusalem remains ours. This is this way of thinking. This is how people are thinking. Well, in May 1948, the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who's the first Prime Minister of Israel, publicly pronounces the Declaration of the State of Israel in Tel Aviv. And whose portrait is hanging above his head there? It's our friend.
Herzl.
It's our friend Theodor Herzl. That's him, right? So that's how important Herzl is in Israeli iconography. Now, his speech is moderately long, so I just want to summarize the main points of it. He makes the case for having a state of Israel, and he rests it on 5 key points: the existence of Old Testament Israel, which had been on that land 2,000 years before, which, as he says, gave to the world the eternal book of books. Well, that's kind of like a deliberately vague terminology. It could be referring simply to the Hebrew scriptures, but it's also saying, well, the New Testament comes from here as well. So the Bible as a whole. The hope of return that Jews had had down the centuries, the promise of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, but we've seen how ambiguous that is, but nevertheless, it is a promise. The massacre of millions of Jews in World War II and the consequent need for a homeland to make sure that this can't happen to them again, and the United Nations resolution of the 29th of November 1947 calling for partition. So those are his 5 pillars that he's standing the argument for his declaration upon. And in that declaration, he says that the new state of Israel would be, quote, open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It'll foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. So he's offering a branch there to the local Palestinians. It'll be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, religious reference. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And it will safeguard the holy places of all religions. And of course, we need to remind ourselves Jerusalem is the holy city for Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam. And Ben-Gurion concludes with an appeal for international support in the best tradition of Theodor Herzl, and also to local Arabs to preserve the peace, though there's not much hope of that.
He didn't have a problem with the local Palestinians being there. He just wanted the Jews to be in control.
Basically, yes. But if you're going to have an open society and a democracy, then you need the Jews to be a majority. So, and the Jews weren't, even then. So you're either going to have to draw the frontiers for your state very carefully, or you're going to have to drive out quite a lot of the non-Jews. Because otherwise, come the first election, it's going to be run by people who are not Jewish and who may not want Israel to be a Jewish state. So basically, everybody's playing with ambiguity here, right? And at least implicit contradiction. Well, the war starts that month, and if you'd been a betting person, you would not have predicted that the Jews would win. Not just because there were more Palestinians than there were Jews, because by this stage the imbalance wasn't gigantic. And in any case, the Palestinians were generally poorer and much worse educated and much less well organized. And as slowly trickled out in the years after this conflict, many Jewish groups of students, young men and women in the years preceding 1948 had gone visiting all kinds of Arab villages in the area to check on how they grew their crops and this kind of thing. But what they were actually doing was checking the entrances to each village. What's the way in? What's the way out? Where are the potential strong points when it comes to fighting? And all of this information was in the hands of the Jewish military leaders. They were extremely well organized in advance. So, coming to 3 maps here, showing the Arab-Israeli war. The first one shows the United Nations partition plan, and as you can see, the 2 areas, well, 3 areas that were for the Palestinians, they are touching or nearly touching. The idea is that they would have something like extraterritorial roads. They wouldn't seriously be cut off from one another, even if the links would be a little tenuous. But that, in turn, means that Israel itself is only a few miles wide for an awful lot of its length. That would have made both sides extremely vulnerable. And that's not how things turned out. What makes the Jewish victory in the war, the Israeli victory in the war, as I think we must now say, so remarkable is not that they beat the Palestinians, but that they beat off all the other Arab armies that were coming in at them from every direction, from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, and indeed from Lebanon. The Israeli army counterattacked and then created the effect that we see a couple of months later in July 1948 in the map on the right hand side there, so that Israel is the area in orange and or yellow there, which is how things remain pretty much until 1967. This next picture shows the Jewish quarter residents fleeing the Jordanian offensive in the old city of Jerusalem through the Zion Gate.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, might be confused. What's happening here and why?
Well, the old city had a lot of Jewish inhabitants, but in fact, it couldn't be held by Israel during this war. So they had to get out. The Jordanians were coming in, and East Jerusalem and the West Bank were actually annexed to Jordan as a result of this war, because that's where the Jordanian armies came in, and they managed to hold that, even if the Arabs in general lost the war as a whole. So Jerusalem becomes a divided city from 1948 until 1967, when Israel captures it in the 1967 war, which we'll look at next week. And our final pictures just show Palestinian refugees getting out of where they had been living and going over the borders into either into the West Bank or into Jordan proper or to Gaza or over into Syria or Lebanon. Palestinian refugees formed significant parts of the population. Refer to the expulsions of 1948 as the Nakba, the catastrophe.
So, this is a pretty remarkable outcome. I mean, by 1948, the Jews were still a minority within Palestine, and to say nothing at all of the armies of the Arab states coming against them. I mean, how were they able to win?
They were extremely well organized. The average Palestinian Jew, certainly at that time, will have been pretty highly educated. They're coming from not the cream of society, but loads, a far higher proportion of them will have come from educated professions in various parts of Europe to come there. So that they will have been much better at organizing themselves than the locals and will have had all kinds of access to modern technologies and stuff like that in a way that the Arabs won't. But nevertheless, it is still an absolutely astonishing achievement. You'll remember a few weeks ago we talked about Christian dispensational eschatology and the particular place it has for Jews in its theology of the end times. I hold no brief at all for that theology, but it seems to me that its best single argument is that Israel came into existence. The rest of us, what can we say? They got it right. The rest of us were wrong, right? Although we are now, if for those who follow such things and want to take such a view, we are now more than 70 years, which is one of the magical numbers in Revelation, from the founding of the State of Israel, and Jesus has not yet come back.
Jesus hasn't returned that you or I know of, so that could be a problem.
Do you think he's lurking around? Maybe he's up a bar somewhere down in Bolivia. I realise on the basis of all these kind of end time movies, it's unthinkable that he would come back to anywhere but the United States. But I just throw that
Right.
out there. Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to be doing next week is wrapping up this series by taking a quick strato cruise through the history of Israel from 1948 up to the present, because there have been major changes both structurally and in the way of thinking of Israelis themselves and their demography and so on. But also there have been changes on the Palestinian side of things, so that this conflict looks very different in many key respects now to what it did in 1948, and we'll be looking at that for next week. So thank you very much, everybody,
So that's goodbye for me.
and it's goodbye from her.
Hey, everybody, and thanks for watching another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. Remember, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook page. We do have a few other social media accounts, but this is where the main action is happening. And it would really help us out if you were interested in reposting our video to your social media or sharing it with your friends. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.